When you recognize that you have a choice that is never compromised, you always have choice. You always have choice on the micro, on the macro. You have choices about your interpersonal dynamics. You have choices about your lifestyle. You have choices about your spiritual perspective and your narration. You are here to express your uniqueness through the power of your choice. Let's talk about trauma and where it all begins. So there are in the field a couple of different types of trauma. There are probably many more that I'm about to list, but there are developmental traumas. There are shock traumas, which are what they sound like. There are medical traumas. There are specific traumatic effects that can be encoded in the nervous system when we are pre-verbal, before we have cognition and memories forming. There are those that can occur later in life and still have an enduring impact, even if it's, an accident that happens in our 20s. The chronic trauma that represents the stress of being a child to unattuned parents is the trauma that interests me most, because it applies to 100% of human beings as far as I can determine. When I list some of the ways that this kind of chronic unattunement can impact us, you may even think, well, this is just like growing up in the generation that we grew up. However, there is so much research, from the still face experiment to attachment theory experimentation, that looks at how essential it is for a caregiver, and potentially specifically a mother, to use her nervous system, and specifically her ventral vagal nervous system. The vagus nerve, you may have heard of, is the largest cranial nerve, and the ventral vagus is the branch of this nerve. This is called Polyvagal Theory, developed by Stephen Porges. This branch innervates the voice box, the inner ear, the heart and lungs, and the facial muscles. So this is called the social engagement system. And it's how we can determine safety through facial expressions. This is a learned exposure. This is a learned conditioning through our caregivers. We aren't born with this. It's something that is co-created. And that's why it's often called co-regulation of the nervous system. So imagine, the impact of masking mothers and children, infants, for multiple years in, this window. It's extraordinary to conceive of the even deeper disruption of that attunement that could have been a potential intended consequence of some of the mask agenda, for reasons that I'm about to discuss, like why it is that when you don't have that attunement, you are so controllable. So when we are raised in these ways and our caregivers don't have the wherewithal, because they are so disconnected from their own system, to attune to ours, to see what we need, to perceive it, to have the bandwidth, so to speak, to meet our needs and observe in ways. Are we flushed and too hot? Are we hungry? Do we need a diaper change? Like, is there something that is like too loud in the environment? Their job is to attune to us as infants, so that we can begin to experience safety in our own expression, right? Our own bodily expression. And then we grow up, right? And we're told things like, you're okay. That's like the ultimate emotional gaslight, right? You're okay. No, I'm actually not. That's why I'm screaming and having a tantrum. Okay, no, I'm not okay, actually. Stop crying. Go to your room and calm down, with no assistance as to how to actually achieve that or accomplish that. Then we go to school, and we are told when we can eliminate. So literally, we are told that we can only pee after we are given permission to do so. And I'll come back to this because, literally the reclamation of urination and the practice of urination is one of the deeper processes of somatic embodiment that I have engaged in my personal life. I'll explain that more later. But then, we go to school and we are micromanaged and conditioned in all of these ways that, of course, in the activism community, we are concerned about. But the ways that we lose control, we are divorced from our biological impulses, is not just, an incidental. It's actually a very, in my perspective, specific part of this disconnection agenda, right? We are often raised by parents who are themselves afraid of other bodies, their own body, right? They're afraid of germs. They're afraid of, illnesses. And so we're running to the doctor all the time, conditioned around the fact that the body makes mistakes, that it is fundamentally reckless and dangerous and unreliable, and that we need to be worried about things like, contagion and dirtiness between us and the invisible enemy in the air. Food is used as a reward. We are told to eat when we are not hungry. So we are disconnected from our own natural sense of satiety and interest in eating. What is hunger actually? Is it something that we engage when we are being praised, or is it something we engage when we actually have a biological need? And then, of course, there is the coupling of our sexual vital force energy and shame. Right. So I've talked about this, whether it's just being too boisterous and jumping around, jumping on the couch, running around, dancing, singing, expressing, emoting when it's like not appropriate, or whether we are, caught masturbating or something like that and shamed for that. If we're shamed as a girl for wearing something inappropriate, like too short a top or too short a skirt. And so we have all of these now heavily normalized ways that we are conditioned around our impulses, our native sense of our inner biological terrain. We are conditioned around this idea that somebody else knows better what's going on inside of us, and that we need to defer to that authority in order to know how to be in this body. So the disconnection between self and body, right? This like Cartesian dualism starts very, very early through seemingly commonplace, patterns of parenting. And this and many other emotional dimensions lead to the crystallization of victim consciousness. And I often talk about how there are two phrases that are specific to, they're like the kind of neon signs of victim consciousness. One is I can't, and the other is I have to. And if you think about all of the disempowerment that is encoded in us through all of these means I just described, of course, you're going to come away feeling like, no, I can't do that. I'm not able to do that. And I have to do this. When you have to do something, it is because you don't believe that you have a choice. And so the reclamation of choice, in my opinion, is the whole point of the process of self-actualization and individualization. So when you recognize that you have a choice that is never compromised, you always have choice. You always have choice on the micro, on the macro. You have choices about your interpersonal dynamics. You have choices about your lifestyle. You have choices about your spiritual perspective and your narration. You are here to express your uniqueness through the power of your choice. So that reclamation process cannot be undertaken without a recognition that the prize, the goal, the holy grail is understanding how to resolve the I have to's into, the experience of personal choice. So our nervous systems are dysregulated by these practices that induce a divorce from our own bodies, by the never really being exposed to the arc of an emotion. So there are many of us who feel like if we start crying, like we might never stop crying. I don't know if you've ever had that inner experience of like the first tears, especially in certain inappropriate places and spaces. You might feel like afraid that there's going to be a tidal wave of tears that's never going to stop. Well, that's because you never experienced emotions as having an arc, because the impediment of your caregiver's own discomfort in their systems around your so-called negative emotions was such that they had to tell you to stop. They had to make it stop, whether it was with a lollipop or a smack, right? That is, how we get to this place where we have a relationship to our own sensations, our own emotions in our body called feelings. That is like an inner warfare. It's an inner battlefield. And what happens to our nervous systems for those reasons and more, including biological toxicity and exposure, to literal toxicants and, dietary influences, et cetera, is that we end up arrested in a state of activation. And the activation can look like all of the trauma responses at once, right? So fight and flight are the sympathetic responses, and also freeze and fawn, right? Which are from the dorsal vagal. This is again part of polyvagal theory. So, which is the sort of primitive lizard-like immobilization response and reflex that our animal nature sort of comes with. So when we are in this freeze, but also this vigilance, there is often an experience in our lives of like running in place, like running a million miles an hour in place. And we express it in different ways. I know I definitely tend more to the vigilant, anxious side of the spectrum, whereas many of my close friends tend more to the freeze and inaction side of the spectrum. And so here is the landscape that has been either intentionally, crafted, conditioned, and enforced and supported, or it's just fertile soil for the latest psychological operation, the latest agenda to render us in service of a power structure that ultimately is not serving us back.